Welcome to another edition of Fight for Justice. Today's topic will be divorces and some of the issues that are related to obtaining a divorce. Unfortunately, 40% of the marriages in this state end in divorce, and ultimately they end up in court, either by settlement or by trial. And there are a lot of steps that are involved in that procedure. So what we're going to talk about today is the divorce process, some of the issues involved. And Freeman, my partner, Freeman Fite, is going to respond to some questions, and I'm going to try to do the same. If you have questions about divorces, we do those, and you can call us or email us at questions@fitelawfirm.com. Anyway, let's start with where you file a divorce. Freeman, where do you file them?
Divorces are filed in circuit court, wherever either you live, wherever you were married. There are other ways, or many different ways, for jurisdiction to attach to somewhere. Typically, you have to live somewhere for a period of 6 months for that area to obtain jurisdiction over your potential divorce.
Yeah, 6 months in the state. What about what county you file it in? Where can you file them?
Typically, it's going to be where you live or where you were married.
Okay, can you file it in a county other than where you lived, where you were married?
I believe you can, but only by agreement.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people do that, not too many, but they may live in Calhoun County or Talladega, but they want to file it in a different county. And they can do that as long as the other party to the divorce doesn't object to it. Now, why would you want to file it in a different county?
Well, you may want to do so to avoid it being printed in the paper. You may want to do so because both parties agree they don't particularly like the judges where they live. They don't want anyone to find out about it just by being nosy. If it's filed somewhere else, it can be a lot easier for it to be kept a secret.
Well, it gives them a sense of privacy and not public when it's in another county, because usually if it's in a county where you live, the word gets out. Now in Anniston, for example, the Anniston Star on Sundays prints the divorce that were granted the week before, and a lot of people don't like that. They print the deeds and they print crimes and all that kind of stuff. So if you're in another county, you don't get it printed on Sunday's newspaper. Now, there is a requirement, as Freeman mentioned, you must be a resident of Alabama for 6 months before you can file a divorce in this state. And that came out of something that occurred, Freeman, before you were around. Alabama used to have what's called a quickie divorce mill. People could fly in here from New York and in one day get a divorce. And the legislature put a stop to that by requiring you live here for 6 months. That's the history of that. Now, let's turn to another subject. Let's turn to the subject of how you get married. Well, everybody kind of knows that, but what about age, Freeman? What age are you permitted to get married?
You're allowed to get married if you're under the age of 18 with consent of your parents. You're not allowed to get married if you're under the age of 16. And obviously, if you're 18 or older, then you can do so without permission from your parents. And, typically you can enter into what's called a common law marriage as well without parental consent. The steps usually are you can either go to a judge, you can go to a priest. You first have to obtain a marriage certificate that has to be signed, a license, in other words, that has to be signed and sent into Montgomery once you are married either by judge or by a pastor or priest or what have you.
All right, let's talk a minute again about common law marriages. We get asked a lot about that over the years. When you have a common law marriage, what does it take to establish a common law marriage? Because that's the marriage where you don't go through a ceremony and you don't get a license, but you can still establish your marital relationships by what Alabama recognizes as common law, and some states don't have that. So talk a little bit about how you establish a common law marriage.
Well, it takes a number of different factors. First, an understanding between both parties that they are going to be married and that they're capable of making that decision, that they cohabitate. Things like splitting bills in a house help to show that. And then a public recognition of the relationship, which means you, and really this is probably the most important aspect of a common law marriage, that you hold yourself out to the community at large as being married. So that you don't say, this is my girlfriend, you say, this is my wife, or this is my husband, and you've made the decision as a couple to hold yourself out to not just a small group of people, but the community at large as being a married couple.
Is there any time limit to establish that?
I don't believe that there is. Obviously, the longer that you do it, the stronger it makes a case for a common law marriage.
Now, I've seen, suppose there is a dispute between the man and the woman about whether they've established a common law marriage. How does that dispute resolved?
It would be just disputed through the courts, just like any other marriage.
Okay. For example, one of the spouses claims might file a complaint for divorce, and the other one might say, well, we're not really married. And then you get into a fact-finding issue by the court to determine if that exists. That's basically the way it occurs.
Of course.
Okay. So once you've established a common law marriage where you don't necessarily agree to it, then the court can proceed to take up all the other issues in a divorce, can't they?
Yes, they can. And you'd go through the normal process then of course, the first thing that will happen anyway will be a complaint will be filed for divorce. And then someone will, file an answer saying that they aren't really married or they are married, and here are my answers to what this person's filed in a complaint.
All right, well, let's divert there a little bit and talk about the process. We talked about the marriage itself and how you get married. Now, what is the process, the paperwork that occurs in obtaining a divorce?
A divorce is just like any other lawsuit, basically. You're going to file a complaint that's going to state your grounds for why you're asking the court to grant you a divorce. The most common reason to file for divorce is irreconcilable differences. That's usually the catch-all that everyone uses, but there are other reasons you can file for divorce, such as
we're gonna
adultery, etc.
I've got that on a short card we're going to show in a minute. But after you file your complaint, then what happens next?
The person is served with that complaint. Once that person has been served with the complaint, they have 30 days to respond by filing an answer to that complaint.
And then what happens after that?
After that, you'll enter into a discovery phase. Well, each side will have an opportunity to ask questions of the other that are under oath, written questions called interrogatories, and a request for production of documents such as tax returns, bank statements, arrest records, anything you can think of, basically.
When we come back in a couple of seconds, we're going to go through the grounds of divorce and tell you how they interplay in the final result, because that's what you're looking for. Get the divorce on the grounds and with the terms that you really want. And we're going to talk about that in the next segment. Okay, this is second segment of the Fite Law Firm show, Fite for Justice. We're talking about divorces today, and we're going to come back to where we left off a minute ago about the process of getting a divorce, and we're talking about filing a complaint, having an answer filed by the other party, then entering into a discovery phase where we're swapping information about assets, liabilities, grounds for divorce, whatever the case may be, child custody issues. And after the discovery phase, Freeman, what comes up next?
Well, usually it would be a trial. Of course, there are other parts of the discovery phase. Depositions can be taken of either party or, other parties such as a mental health professional, whoever, the lawyers deem necessary to take a deposition from. And that would be followed by your case being placed, it goes from the docket to a trial week and gets set for trial where the lawyers decide how long will it take to try this case? Can it be tried in a matter of a couple of hours? Can it be tried in a day? Is it going to take longer than that? And the court will set aside that amount of time to have a trial on the issues of your divorce.
Now that varies from county to county. In some counties, unfortunately, you have to wait till your turn comes up. In the Calhoun County, we have a good system. They call up the cases a couple of weeks ahead of time, and you're given a day and a time to start your case, and you're given it so much time to finish it. Rarely do you get a case lasting more than 2 days. I've had them to go 5 days, and some of them even go into the second week. You mentioned a minute ago, Freeman, something about discovery, and you mentioned the word depositions and interrogatories. Would you explain to our listeners what a deposition is and what interrogatories are?
First, an interrogatory is written questions that one side will get to ask the other, asking for basic information, asking for complex information. And these questions have to be answered in writing within 30 days, and those answers are given under oath. So you might ask if that person has been faithful in their marriage, if they've ever been abusive in any way. And the other person then has to answer those questions and have to do so under oath. A deposition is a lot like interrogatories, except it's a live situation where both parties, the person having their deposition taken, which could be, like I said earlier, it could be one of the parties, it could be a third party with knowledge of what the grounds for divorce will be. A court reporter is in the room to write down the questions and answers to those questions from the lawyers, which is also done under oath and can be read at trial or used to impeach someone if their testimony changes from the time of deposition to the time of trial.
And its primary function is to discover information that you may not have, that you may want to have. Now, generally, I think what we do is we do interrogatories first, and then if we look for, based on that, we can decide whether we want to take somebody's written statement, or verbal statement rather, under oath before a court reporter. And those depositions can be videotaped. And what do you think about videotaping domestic court depositions? Do you think it's necessary?
I don't believe it's necessary in a domestic court situation. Depositions usually are not necessary at all in domestic situations, divorce situations. In some they can be, but in most they're not going to be, in my opinion. If you get into accident cases, personal injury cases, videotaping depositions can be very helpful, especially if it's a doctor. But typically in a divorce, people are going to be available to testify at trial. It's usually not necessary. Although that's not always the case.
You make a good point about videotaping. Several years ago, I had an accident case out on 202, and the lady we represented was taken to a Birmingham hospital for trauma treatment. And I decided that I would videotape the doctor's deposition, because typically doctors don't come to trials, especially if they're out of town. But if you play back the videotape of his statements, it's very, very effective. And it can help you or it can hurt you. In this case, this lady was banged up pretty bad and had suffered some pretty good injuries, and I happen to have a picture from the state trooper of her still in the vehicle because it was crushed all around her and they had to use the jaws of life to get her out. And I found that out that they had they had those pictures of her. So when we took the trauma surgeon's deposition in Birmingham, I thought about it and I said, I bet these doctors have never seen where their patients come from. So I had the pictures with me. I got them out and I showed them. There were 2 trauma surgeons. Got them out and I handed them to her and I asked him something like this: is this injuries in this situation consistent with the injuries you saw on your patient that you had to treat her for? And he looked right in the camera as I'm doing right now, and he hesitated. He didn't say anything, and the lawyers around the table, because all the lawyers are present during the deposition, and we all were wondering the same thing: what in the world is he going to say? Because you like to know what people are going to say before you ask them. You don't always have that luxury, though. He looked right in the camera after looking at the pictures, and he looked up and he said, "Oh my God, how did she survive this?" Well, that was worth a lot of money when he said that, because that brought home the picture of how difficult and how much suffering and pain that lady had gone through. Now, back to divorce cases, I agree with Freeman. It's usually not necessary to videotape depositions, but you might want to take a deposition of at least of the parties when you do that. Now, we talked about filing, the answering process, the timetable, by the way. I don't think we mentioned how long it takes to get a divorce. It can be as little as a week or two. If they're in agreement, you can come to agreement anywhere between the beginning and the end of the process.
I think it's important to note there that you could have an agreement in a matter of an hour, but if there's typically a lot of questions about contested, uncontested divorces. If you're in a situation where you're going to have an uncontested divorce and you're going to be able to agree on who gets what and where the children are if you have any, then you can reach an agreement really quickly. But it takes 42 days for that agreement to become final once it's signed by a judge, and you still have to wait 60 days from that time before you can marry again, or the next marriage will be invalid.
Now that brings up another question. Alabama has a unique statute that you can't get a final decree until 30 days has passed from the time you file a complaint. So as Freeman was talking about, if you have an agreement within a week and you file all this material with the judge and the court, she has to approve it, the judge does, you're still not finally divorced until that 30 days passes.
Well, you actually have to wait to 42 because they could always appeal it.
Yeah.
I've been in those before as well where, people aren't careful with their uncontested divorces. They may not seek out proper legal counsel, or they may just sign it hastily, and they will be in a situation where then they have to go and try to appeal it or have it set aside, which isn't easy to do.
So you've got that time problem. You got to be careful. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about alimony, what every man loves to pay. Welcome back to the third and final segment of our show today. We were talking about divorce. We've been through what it takes to get one. First of all, you got to be married, of course, and then what the process is. And this segment, we're going to talk about some other issues in a divorce, mainly the grounds for divorce. What are the basis in Alabama for a court being given the right, that's called jurisdiction, the right to grant a divorce? And Alabama has, I think, 13 grounds for divorce, and some of these are rarely ever used. But if you put that slide up, we'll talk about the grounds. Freeman, go ahead and tell us about the grounds for divorce.
Well, according to the slide, at least the first is physically and incurably incapacitated at the time of marriage, which could mean a lot of different things. You could be, just out of your mind, insane. And then the second one would be adultery, which is unfortunately somewhat common. The third is voluntary abandonment for a period of 1 year. The fourth is imprisonment in a penitentiary, sentenced for 7 years after 2 years is served, which is definitely something you will not see very often as a grounds for divorce. Number 5, commit crime against nature. That's also very uncommon as a grounds for divorce. 6, addicted to alcohol or drugs. That one somewhat, in my opinion, is common. 7, incompatibility. That is by far and away the most common ground for divorce. That's basically used as a catch-all for.
And what does that mean?
It just means you don't get along. You're not compatible anymore. You could have been at one time, but now you're not. I believe 8 was confined in a mental hospital. That's also not done with any frequency at all. 9, irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. That is often used in concert with incompatibility. They're filed basically as one and the same. 10, when wife is pregnant at the marriage without the husband's knowledge or agency. 11, actual violence or reasonable apprehension of actual violence. That one, unfortunately, is somewhat common as well. The 12th grounds for divorce in this state of Alabama, 2 years of separation without support, and then last, 2 years after separate maintenance.
Now, as to these grounds, you can use any one of them or many of them in concert with each other, can you not?
Oh, sure. You could use all of them. That'd be a bad marriage to be in,
Well, yeah,
but
it would be
technically
terrible.
you could use all of them.
Yeah. So does it make any difference In the outcome of the case, though, and the property settlement, which ground you allege and prove?
It can make a difference. You know, if it's just incompatibility, that's not going to be as strong of a ground as it would be as adultery, or physical violence or verbal abuse would be against one of the parties involved.
What I'm talking about, though, is one of the issues in every divorce case is a property settlement.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've got a grounds of incompatibility, that's kind of a no-fault ground. But if you allege and prove adultery, is the court supposed to consider that and give it more weight in awarding property or alimony payments?
Yes, and that's basically what I was trying to say. You know, incompatibility can be no fault of anyone. If you're verbally abused or physically abused, or you've been cheated on, then the judge can give that extra weight to help them make the decision on who gets what and how much of what.
Okay, when you start a case and one party suspects adultery on the other, and you know, talk about what it takes to prove adultery. What do you have to have? What kind of evidence do you have to have? Do you have to catch them in the act, so to speak, or is there something less than that that you can prove?
You don't necessarily have to catch them in the act, although obviously that would be helpful. A lot of people will pay investigators to follow their significant other, but you can also use common sense things. Two people may be in the same hotel, they may not be sharing a room, but they've lied about where they are, and now they're in the same place. You can use phone records. Nowadays, a lot of people use Facebook or other online services.
Text messages.
You can subpoena, you know, evidence from phone companies.
Aren't you amazed by what people will put on Facebook?
Always amazed.
And they just lay their whole life out there, and you can find out so much because they don't realize they're creating a record that's going to come back to haunt them.
Absolutely, and they may think they can delete it, but actually they can't, because if one party's really paying attention, then they may be taking what are called screenshots or taking pictures of a computer screen to show that this was posted at this time and have evidence of it in case the other person does delete it.
And we've had cases where we use that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, those are the grounds. You allege them, you have to prove them. And the judge has to be satisfied from the evidence. These divorce cases are all non-jury, just before a judge. In this county, we have 2 judges who hear divorce cases. In Talladega, it's 1. In some counties, the judges who hear all kinds of cases, divorce, crimes, and civil cases. So it depends on where you are, what kind of situation you're going to be in. Now, we get a lot of questions also about annulling a marriage. A lot of people want to annul it. Sometimes it's because it's been a short-term marriage. I had a guy that called me the other day, been married 1 week, decided he made a mistake, and he wanted to annul it. Sometimes it's done on basis of religious beliefs, particularly with people who happen to be Catholic. They like to annul them rather than go through a divorce. So tell us what it is. Tell us what an annulment, how you get an annulment.
Well, you file it much like you would for a divorce. You file a complaint for an annulment. That has to be based on, essentially, the most important factor is that you have to have some sort of fraud as to the essentials of a marriage. So if you get married and someone is saying they want kids, and you marry them and you find out the next day that's not true, they don't want to have kids.
Or they can't have them and knew it.
Or yes.
They misled you going into the marriage, something like that. That's what you're talking about. And you have to allege and prove those to get a court to annul a marriage, and that is, it's pretended as a finding that you never were married is what happens. So it satisfies whatever your goal is if you can prove those things.
Annulments are typically pretty uncommon. I have just recently filed one, but you typically don't see that many of them.
Yeah, you don't, because most people who are getting divorced, it's not a week after the marriage, it's usually several years after the marriage. Some people refer to it as a 7-year itch for some reason. So you've been married 3 or 4 months now?
I have.
Yeah. So we got no itch there. He's happily married. I'm proud of him for that. We don't promote people get divorces. We let they decide. We just carry it out. And we don't perform any social services. We leave that up to psychologists. Anyway, that's about the end of our show today. We look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday nights at 9:30. and as otherwise broadcast. Good to see you.